welcome to another of our webinars. And today's title is Bringing Open Banking to the High Street. And we're going to be bringing some of the human touch to the high street as well, once we get into having a conversation with Duncan from OneBanks. Before that, and before we start, we're going to be taking a poll with you, and we'll take a poll at the end as well. And then in between time, well, I'll set a little bit of the scene, and then we'll speak to Duncan and find out more about OneBanks and why we feel that it's worth us having these conversations, because as we all know, branches, our high street, banking on our high street has changed dramatically over the last few years. So it's something I found myself asking myself the question, is this a myth or is this a reality that we need to address it? And am I just repeating the mantra that everyone else is, or is there real merit to it? So it's great to have this conversation. Some of you may have been with us before, and you know that I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Digital Banking and Finance at LIBF. Some of you are fellows and members of LIBF. And I would encourage, hi Tarek, everyone to consider the membership. Our knowledge bank is deep, and also things like our new certificate in FinTech Practitioner that we're launching with Lendit. We're coming out with very of the moment academia meets industry offerings for you. So have a look around both the LIBF main site and the Digital Center site as well. Hey, Sean, I really like your background there. Okay. So before we get stuck in, Rox, do you think we can have the poll? We start out with the poll today. Let's see. So so there we are. Given that digital and or mobile banking is so popular now, is there still a need for a physical banking presence? So we'll let you, members of the audience who are with us so far, our participants, tell us what you think. Oh, so far, physically is overwhelmingly yes. Hi from Dhaka. It's gone a little neck. It's coming to a conclusion. Okay, so at this point, 89% of you to 11% of you think that we should still have a physical presence, and Duncan will be happy to hear about that later on. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're gonna also take this poll when we conclude. And I think we can now close the poll as well. Okay. So we all think, or you all think, that there still is a need for a physical presence before we get stuck in. And clearly, I think we can say that banking has changed beyond all recognition in terms of the high street. It's no surprise to any of us that the branches, we've seen branches closing, we've seen the high street changing, and that's been happening over the last few years, but it's happening recently at a much more frightening pace, in my opinion. If you think back to 1960, when we had 150 banks, and that dropped down in 2010 to having 6 main banks have nearly 80% of the business accounts in this country, clearly the Competition and Markets Authority thought that wasn't a good thing. And then we moved into open banking, which we may touch on later on in terms of vulnerability and vulnerable customers. But obviously, we've all seen this happening. And I was interested to find out that since January 2015, if you'll indulge me some statistics, banks and building societies closed or are scheduled to close 3,770 branches since that time. So that's a rate of around 55 a month. And we know that in next year, in 2021, TSB has said they're going to close another 164. So in 2017, this was nearly 900 a year. And then it was nearly 800 a year in 2018. And then it dropped off a bit in 2019 to 400 odd. But that is a lot of branch closures for something that, bricks and mortar outlets is something that we all got very used to. The Southeast, not surprisingly, has been hit the hardest, followed by the Northwest, and then of course in Scotland. And Duncan, you'll be able to comment on that a bit later as well. So we ask ourselves, why is this happening? Clearly, everyone is moving on to a digital bank. During COVID, during the pandemic, I think nearly 12% of the population downloaded and used their incumbent mobile banking app for the first time. So it's not a surprise right now that we're all going digital. There are certain parts of the population and age groups that are more digitally native and have gone there first as well. And there's been a drop off in visits to the branches. So according to UK Finance, the trade body that represents banks, 71% of adults use online banking in 2017, and that was 38 million people. And as I said, during COVID, in the March to April month, 12% of the population downloaded the app. So we're not going into the branches, but we can, as we've seen with Monzo or Starling, use PayPoint, use the post office. Those of us who are old enough to remember, the post office has a banking facility, and has been there as a banking facility for many years. Mobile banking vans are seeing a resurgence. NatWest and Lloyd's, and I think actually Barclays has launched theirs as well. As somebody who used to use the mobile library in Hertfordshire, I can understand the mobile banking van. We have community bankers, where a bank, for example, with NatWest, will deploy some of their staff into the communities. And of course, we have tech support, which some people are comfortable with and some people are not comfortable with. So these are some of the alternatives. But Duncan, I don't want to see you as say you're an alternative, because I think you're a very good solution. You are also providing with OneBanks an alternative. So this is a great time for you to join us and introduce yourself and OneBanks, and then we can get stuck into finding out how it works, what the tech is about, why you've done it, who you're partnering with other fintechs, for example, to bring more to the offering, and why you feel so strongly about the fact that we need a human touch. So over to you, Duncan.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me. And it's great to have so many of you on the webinar today. So just a wee bit of background to myself. I was at KPMG for around 5.5 years. And during that time, I actually went away to California and learned how to code. And as part of that, I got really interested in open banking and the opportunities that that can enable from an entrepreneurial and innovation perspective. And I suppose I was interested in open banking, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a conceptual perspective. Like, what is open banking trying to achieve? It's trying to increase competition in banking. It's trying to help people better manage their finances. But at the same time, coming back to Scotland, like Helene said, there's just such a void on the high street where banks used to be. And that's kind of where the OneBanks idea came from. Is just open banking is trying to aggregate different banks into one physical location, but it's just leaving so many people behind. Helene said there's 71% of people who have access to online banking. That means there's 29% of people who don't. And open banking is great. It's got lots of opportunities, but is at risk of leaving people behind who don't have online banking, because one of the prerequisites is that you need an online banking presence to enable the benefits of open banking. So that
Duncan, one of the questions that people were asking about the UK
Yes.
numbers, and I think you've addressed them, and also the reminder that we just heard it in the news about the future access to cash proposals that have come out by the government. I'm sure you'll touch on that.
Indeed. So just in terms of the background to OneBanks, we started looking at access to cash and financial inclusion. Those are the two main items that we're looking to address, and we recognise the fact that there is post office in the market. However, we do believe that there is an alternative by using open banking to better help people have access to their underlying bank accounts. So what OneBanks can offer is access to, it's a physical location, and it's located in, for example, in focal points of communities, whether it's a supermarket, a train station, a retail outlet, and we can service everyday banking transactions. So that's cash deposits, cash withdrawals, payments, transfers. We've got an educational experience. So we've got 2 members of the team at all times at the kiosk who will be help people transition and to have an online banking presence, sign up to OneBanks, and just teach them about the benefits of online banking. And we are going live at the end of this year.
Wow. So we're new. You're not live yet. So it's coming.
It's coming. And as you mentioned, the UK, there's the access to cash pilot, which is happening just now, and there's lots of good solutions. And that is a scheme which is to match up solution providers with communities which are underbanked. So OneBanks is partnered with the Communities Access to Cash pilot and are going live, and we are launching our solution, and it's part of the Communities Access to Cash pilot. So we're going live in Denny, which is a small town near Falkirk in Scotland. And Denny is a perfect example of an area which is underbanked and at risk of being financially excluded, because it had 4 banks 5 years ago, and it currently doesn't have any bank branches at all. And it's one of the top most deprived towns in Scotland, and yeah, OneBanks will make a big difference to that community in terms of helping vulnerable customers transition to a digital first future. So we're not a bank, to make that clear. All we're doing is enabling access to users' underlying bank account.
So you're agnostic, aren't you?
We're
You're
completely agnostic.
kiosks are agnostic, any bank and
Any bank at all. And yeah, as I said, financial inclusion is at the forefront of what we're trying to do. And we've built that. We've worked with partners who've got financial inclusion, recognize the importance of financial inclusion as well. And I suppose just what is financial inclusion? Financial inclusion means, well, it's defined by the availability of equal opportunities to access financial services. And it means that businesses and individuals have access to useful and affordable financial products and services that meet their specific needs. So that could be everyday banking, that could be payments, it could be credit, it could be an insurance, and it needs to be delivered in a responsible and sustainable way. So the way I see it, there's two key elements of financial inclusion. First of all is having access, and second of all is having the availability to actually use it. So in terms of access, globally, there's been huge strides forward in terms of financial inclusion. 1.2 billion adults worldwide have got access to an account since 2011. And so that's 69% of adults now have access to a bank account, which is a huge increase. However, one of the main blockers that I see in financial inclusion, and one of the blockers to increasing financial inclusion, is identity. And the fact that in the UK, you might not think it's a big problem, but there's 11 million people in the UK that don't have access, don't have a passport or a driving license. And in terms of the blockers to having and getting through the identity assurance process, you need ID evidence, you need a fixed address, you need access to the internet, and you need a mobile phone. And there's a lot of people in the UK who don't have that, whether it's because the 90,000 households in temporary accommodation, such as hostels or those who are homeless, or people who don't have access to the internet. Helena, you mentioned the number of people who have been using apps for the first time during lockdown. Well, this is a statistic that I could not believe. There's 6 million people in the UK who cannot turn on a mobile device, and 7.1 million who can't even access an app or open an app. So that just shows the number of people who are at risk of being left behind. And putting that back into context of bank branch closures, financial inclusion is all about giving people what they need. And yes, open banking gives people one element of that because it helps people better manage their finances. But there's lots of different elements of financial inclusion. And I understand that, like, when I actually spoke to somebody from Australia this morning who said, and my chat is that bad, it always comes back to financial inclusion because it means so much. And he said that in Australia, they use bank accounts, just who's got a bank account, as the main measure of financial inclusion. And while that is one measure, I'm of the opinion that there's a lot of different measures that need to be considered to actually have a good proxy of financial inclusion.
Okay, can I ask you as well, recently, because I was on the FCA data sprint for SME lending post-COVID, obviously, because the things we need to look forward, not forensically. But there was also a group working on vulnerability and one on identity. Are you thinking that because of what's happened with COVID and the fact that we will have many more people who are categorized or who categorize themselves as vulnerable, that this definition of financial inclusion and the need for people to be given access that works for them will widen and also become much more come to the fore in minds of banks? Because we all know that when you work for an incumbent bank, for example, when you hear vulnerable, or if you ring a bank now, you get that tape that says if you're feeling vulnerable, stay on the line. Yeah. Alarm bells and whistles go off somewhere in the bank, and some other solution needs to be provided. Right?
Yeah. So one I don't like about the word vulnerable is, like, some of the banks categorize people as vulnerable, but there's so many different elements of society which could be vulnerable, and putting them all into one bucket I don't think is appropriate at all. Everybody's got their different needs and requirements, whether it's those who are financially less well off, whether it's people who are deaf, blind, mentally unstable. Everybody needs to be dealt with individually. And I understand that banks is not commercially viable for banks to help all of these individual user groups, but that's where a shared infrastructure solution like OneBanks is genuinely there to support the banks and enable a cost-efficient way to actually help them help their customers as we move towards that inevitable shift towards the cashless future. And going back to your question, yes, it's put a lot more of a focus, the COVID, on vulnerable customers, because we've come to realize that those who are vulnerable in society, maybe it's their age that makes them more vulnerable, we need to look after them. And yeah, that's definitely come to the forefront of people's attention throughout lockdown, for sure.
We've actually had two questions in the chat. One of them was about the digital banking having a greater impact on the wealth gap. What about those people who are not online and are left behind? I think you've mentioned this. And then the other question is age an issue for a number of people in Britain who have stated lack of use to a mobile phone or the use of an app? And the age thing, I always struggle with where we draw the line. She says at 60, am I in that group where I'm not supposed to be technically adept, right? Where is the line? Are we talking beyond that or otherwise, right?
There is no line. It's all about banks can't drive the change. It needs to be let people feel comfortable with what they're comfortable with. We shouldn't force people to go online at a rate to which they're not comfortable, because that introduces more risk. That introduces cyber and digital risk that is very prevalent. So if people don't want to use digital, they shouldn't be forced to go digital. However, having a OneBanks kiosk in the forefront, in the focal point of the community, it gives people somewhere to go to where they can learn about the benefits. They can get help getting moving online because there's that human touch. I think one thing is that people need people, and I think innovation innovation needs to work for everybody. Innovation's good, everybody can get behind it, and it's just trying to help people get behind it and understand the benefits and how to use it and the risks associated is really important by having that the human touch.
Physically, you mentioned that you have the kiosk, in a supermarket or in a prominent place. What is the physical setup? Is there an ATM? Is there a place that I sit? Is there, what's happening physically?
Yeah, so there's both. So we've designed the kiosk with three main experiences. We've got experience one, where there's a member of the OneBanks team, and that experience is a seating area. There's surface chargers, and it's focused on, it's an educational experience. We teach people about the benefits of online banking. We help them get signed up to digital banking if they've got an account but don't feel comfortable with online banking, and we help them get signed up to OneBanks. Experience two is an over-the-counter experience, and users can do cash deposits, cash withdrawals, payments, transfers, and just have oversight of your account and balances for any bank. And you're doing that with the help of a member of the team, with the OneBanks team. And then experience three is a self-service ATM, which is primarily, we designed it for small businesses, and we're recognizing the fact that they require something different to individuals. So a speedy self-service, you can deposit money, withdraw money, and it's cardless. And that's something that's really interesting about the OneBank solution, is that we don't require physical cards. One thing that I do feel passionate about is the fact that we will go cardless before we go cashless.
Right.
I think cash is, with the number of bank branches that are closing, even post offices are diminishing in numbers. A lot of people in society do have a lack of access to cash. And as I said, financial inclusion is about providing people with what they want, and a lot of people still want cash. It's true that cash has been in steady decline since 2012, following the introduction of contactless payment terminals, and more recently, cashless transport systems. But 2 million people in the UK, it was part of the Access to Cash report that was issued in 2019. They said that 2 million people in the UK rely on cash every day, and that includes many vulnerable groups across the country. And a further 7 million people say that they use cash on a regular basis. So that's 9 million people in total rely on cash. And if you're taking bank branches out of society, it means that they're going to struggle. And especially for SMEs, they're going to struggle to have somewhere to deposit cash.
And I think at one point there was a question about less money was being printed, but there was still more money in circulation. And the assumption was that it was going onto people's mattresses, because when there are times of uncertainty, gold and notes become the thing that everybody reverts back to. We've had, to go back to the channel for a minute, we've had some people, thank you very much to the person who's retired at 77, and you are still tech adept, thank goodness. Wendy says, if we accept the fact that the penetration rate of mobile phones, not necessarily smartphones, in the UK is 77%, then omni-channel seems a sensible way forward. And then Diraj is asking about, we'll get to your model. How does your model break even? As in, who bears the cost of handling cash, for example, but we haven't got to your business model yet as well. And also the partners, because we're talking about digital identity. Presumably, if I'm cardless, you need either my face or my thumbprint or something about me that identifies me as well, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Vera's asking about the range of services, so go ahead.
So I'll actually start from the end. So the range of services, we are very much so starting with an MVP, and we'll continue to innovate. So at the moment, the two main services, the two main challenges that we're trying to address are access to cash and financial inclusion. And we're doing that, as I said, with cash deposits, cash withdrawals, payments, and account aggregation for any bank. We'll look to expand that into being able to work with the banks to open and close bank accounts, potentially offer advice, remit money abroad, and having people's identity and having that focal point in town. There's lots of different opportunities, and that's why we will look to work with communities to try and identify what people want and what people need. It's really what I find great about this is the fact that it's in a supermarket. You have to go and do your shopping, and it's convenient therefore to do your, whether it's cash deposits, whether it's, and speaking to people in Denny, where we're going live at the end of the year, they're excited about the fact that they've been chosen to have this solution. A lot of the time, places like Denny are potentially, they think banks are leaving them behind. They genuinely think that, and therefore they are excited about almost bypassing conventional banking and taking them from somewhere that's underbanked to something that's potentially even like a smart city.
So, and do I need to bring something physical to get myself started, or is it literally just?
So in terms of getting started, someone will come to the OneBanks kiosk. We are a payment institute. We're regulated. We're working with NewPay. We'll come on to partners in a bit, but we're regulated by the FCA. So we need to do KYC and AML and money laundering. And that is actually it's very advantageous for the banks. And it's quite unique, the fact that we are able to analyze transactions across a number of different banks. There was something in the news recently about HSBC and money laundering and the fact they weren't doing enough. So that is something we're implementing as part of it. So yeah, if someone turns up to the OneBanks kiosk, they have to do this 3 simple onboarding steps. So it's very basic, high level information, and all of this can be done without a smartphone and using the kiosk tablet, which you can go through with a team member. But enter very basic information. You scan your driving license or passport, and we do the identity check, and you take a selfie. And that selfie will then be stored in the back end and hashed using trust stamps technology. And then any time that a user would come to the kiosk again, we will authenticate them using their date of birth and their facial biometrics. So in Experience 2, they do that using the kiosk tablet, and Experience 3, they'll do that directly onto the ATM. So they get their face scanned and their profile loads up, and they can click on deposit, and then choose the bank account they want to deposit the money into. And then, they can enter the cash into the NCR machine, the ATM, and it'll count it, validate it, and send a message to our head office account, which will process the payment using faster payments. And the user will have the updated cash balance in a matter of seconds. One thing, obviously, that is risky, a challenge for any startup is trust, and the way that we're trying to get over that trust barrier with users is the fact that they're using AISP, and people can get that instantaneous update to their account balance to show that it's worked. I see some more questions coming in. So what if you're 80 years old and do not have a passport or driving license? Well, that's why we're working with Trust Stamp. As I said, what we're launching is MVP, and what Trust Stamp do brilliantly is they focus on financial inclusion and trying to provide people with bank accounts and access to the formal financial system if they don't have a driving license or a passport. But for the time being, when we go live, unfortunately, that is a requirement. Ultimately, we're servicing banks, and at the moment, the banks that we're servicing require you to have a passport or driving license to sign up. So it's all a stepping stone process, but I hope that kind of answers the question. The fact that we are working on that, but at the moment we're servicing banks who require you to have a passport or driving license. We might look to extend that to credit unions, etc. in the future.
That was going to be my question. And also, I think there are alternative forms of data around, but not every bank will accept that. Then maybe they take a 360 view, and some of the credit rating agencies also take a 360 view, particularly around things like social media or unstructured data versus structured data. And we have more and more unstructured data available to us now, meaning that everyone in the banking industry needs to look at the AI side of use cases to take this unstructured data and do something with it. We've got a lot of questions, actually. Your business model. Get to your business model, Duncan, because I think this is...
Business model is we charge the banks. Our service is always free for customers, consumers, and SMEs to deposit and withdraw cash and to speak to somebody. So as I said, bank branches, they cost around £700,000 per bank branch a year, and that's only operating costs alone. So what we're providing the banks is a way in which they can withdraw their presence, which is inevitable because they're doing that anyway, but still facilitate access and have that physical place on the high street. As we said at the start of this, is 89% of you think that there's still a need for a physical location on the high street. And as banks are showing with the 3,770 bank branches that have closed since 2015, that is not going to happen. Like the banks cannot, it's not commercially viable for the banks to maintain a presence.
The only bank that I know of, and I think this is true, I heard it from the woman who does their operations, is Metro Bank. 80% of the rent for their stores is covered by hiring out their safety deposit boxes. But I think you're right. Everyone else, it's a great business model. Everyone else is using COVID as an excuse to accelerate bank branch closures. Exactly. And this is a global thing, right?
It's a global thing. So they're leaving a lot of people behind. And that's why, OneBanks will charge the banks and try to give the banks as much flexibility as possible in terms of locations.
And there is a question, why would they use you instead of the post office? And I'm sure you have features that, like, we know that there's sign language on there, and as someone who's a sign language user.
Yeah, and even the kiosk has been designed with guidance from Disability and Equality Scotland. So it's wheelchair accessible. The NCR machines have got Braille. And as you said, we're working with SignLive to help those who are deaf. In terms of other differences, the post office don't do any AML checks. They pass over the risk onto the banks to deal with retrospectively. However, what OneBanks is doing is offering the banks sort of first line of defense, in effect. Secondly, we are focused on solely the banking part of the banking element. So we're not cross-selling at all, which obviously the post office has got a franchise model. So every postmaster is trying to sell as much as they can and be as successful as possible. So I think that makes a difference. And then also our opening hours. So our opening hours will be in line with wherever we're situated. So for example, if we're in a supermarket, there'll be maybe 15, 16 hours a day. So extensive opening hours as well plays a big part. And also for the bank's perspective, we're a cheaper alternative than the post office. We're using more sophisticated technology, open banking, to facilitate transactions at a far lower cost. So I think those are the main differences. The post office has got a huge estate across the UK, and therefore there's definitely enough room in the market for us to work as well as the post office to help drive financial inclusion.
Do you think that at some point, I think Starling Bank is using the post office and Monzo was using Pay It, which some of us may remember using for electricity bills back in the day. But do you think that some of the challenger banks will eventually also come to you and be part of what's happening. Because I used to say to people all the time, you have an iPhone, but I can't shove the £100 I'm about to give you in there, right? So it was inevitable that we had all this hype about everything, the bank in your pocket and all the other stuff that was going on there, that at some point someone would have to acknowledge the fact that the hype curve had to drop a bit and get back to, as you're saying, the number of people that use cash for whatever the reason is, whether they're unbanked or otherwise, having a place to put it.
So a lot of people use cash just for, as you said, just for trust, security and budgeting. There's a lot of reasons. It's more spontaneous. But in terms of your question, Neil, challenger banks, yes, as in OneBanks would provide them with a way in which they can grow their top line. And ultimately what we're trying to do is give people the opportunity to choose their bank based on the services that they provide rather than the geographic location. Especially for SMEs, a lot of the choice of bank is driven by, oh, where can I deposit this cash, rather than what bank gives them the biggest benefit. So yeah, I think our solution does give neo-challenger banks a boost and gives them greater exposure to a different demographic that they didn't previously have any exposure to. Yeah.
We have a few questions on AML compliance as well. Compliance element, you're taking on the responsibility from the bank of AML advice, etc.
No, we're acting. We have to do it. We're not taking it on. We're doing something in addition to what the banks already do.
Can a business register with you for their customers to facilitate payment of services? Or is that still, I have to go through my business bank account and do it that way?
So sorry, I don't quite understand that question. So,
yeah, Martha, you might want to, if you can give us a bit more detail on there. I think you're trying to say, can you register directly? But what Duncan is saying is that he's facilitating for the bank. So I would think the answer to this is no, you still have to go through your bank.
You still have to have a bank account. You always have to have a bank account. If you've got a business bank account, you can register with OneBanks and you can do cash deposits, cash withdrawals from your business bank account. But you always need to have, I think I understand your question. It's regarding like bill payments, for example. And it's if I've understood that correctly, it's a good question. So not yet, but it is something that we're looking into, is to innovate in the bill payment space. And I know there was something that PayPoint Ofgem released last week, I think it was, regarding PayPoint being a monopoly and about competition law. And yeah, we'll definitely look to innovate in that space going forward.
Okay. So let's start from the bottom. I'm treasurer of several community banks who've been trying 2 years to hand over an account to another treasurer who's an accountant, and the bank placed one obstacle after another to prevent the mandate transfer. Is that something that you
transferring bank accounts, so changing bank is very, very difficult. And unfortunately, that's not something that we can make any easier to begin with. But again, the sooner that we can get this out and the sooner that we work with the banks, the better. As in, that's something that's definitely up there on our agenda, to be able to open and close bank accounts on behalf of the banks. But at the moment, in our service, what we're doing, we can do all of these services without the permission of the banks, in effect, because of open banking. We've got open banking, AISP, PISP, so we can process the payments on behalf of the banks.
Right. So you're too, I'm giving you access.
I completely agree. Business bank accounts in particular are very difficult to change. So definitely a good point.
Large amounts in relation to AML.
Regarding AML, it comes back to partners that we're working with. So we're working with Comply Advantage, who are implementing our transaction risk monitoring. So we've got a whole bunch of rules, and we've got a money laundering reporting officer, and part of our AML team will be analysing the rules and the transactions that flow through. So
you've got NuaPay, Comply Advantage, the trust stamp.
We've got lots of different
money.
It's a brilliant way to bring this to market as quickly as possible. There's a clear problem in society, and the quickest way to bring it to market is by leveraging what's out there. So yeah, as you said, we are leveraging a lot of different third parties. We've got NCR, who are providing our hardware, and some of the integrated software. Endava are helping us build the IT infrastructure, and as part of that, Trust Stamp are doing the authentication and the re-authentication of users using facial biometrics. And NuaPay we're becoming an agent of NuaPay and leveraging the FCA regulations. So that's AISP, PISP, and money remittance. And who have I missed, Helene?
Money Hub.
Money Hub, we're using
Yep.
AISP, the technical service provider.
So this is really that one of those great examples of where you have something that is the core, and then you have all the different. Yeah,
really
absolutely.
Collaboration, and it's trying to bring together a lot of different bits in the market into one physical place, to which is trying to be as inclusive as possible and trying to make all these brilliant solutions available to everybody.
There are a few questions about, the mandate versus the signature, et cetera, and the vision for 5 years. But actually, I want to ask you a question. As you were just talking, we were talking about the partnerships. Some of Duncan, I've spent years working with fintechs and financial institutions to try and get them to collaborate. I'm sitting here asking myself, why hasn't one of the banks come up with this? Why?
Some of the banks did a shared business banking hub, and there's lots of reasons why it needs to be an independent party. So there was between 6 and 8 pilots that were run. It was Barclays, Lloyds, and NatWest, I believe, who did the shared business banking hub, and they were, as I said, there was lots of reasons why it wasn't successful. The location was out of towns, so it was hard to get to. It wasn't convenient. Governance was hard, as you can imagine. Getting banks to work together is never easy. And lastly, Competition Market Authority, I think there was difficulties with that as well. So that's one of the reasons why banks are being very receptive to what we're doing, because they realize they have tried to do this, but it needs to be an independent party. So they're trying to share their learnings with OneBanks to make sure that it can be a success.
Okay, now you answered my question.
It's about trying to make all banks available, whereas that specific hub was only 3 of the banks.
Right. Okay. So this can extend out. Could it also potentially at some point be, if I'm not a bank, but I'm a corporate with a financial solution with a bank of record in the background, can I still do that as well? So if I am Uber and I have a financial solution for my drivers, could they also, because that might be a more transient population at times as well, or can they also then get on board with it?
Sorry, what do you mean? So
let's imagine that I'm a corporate, but I create a banking platform solution with a bank of record in the background.
Understood.
So eventually, could that also?
That could be part of it as well. That's the great thing. There's so many different innovative builds on top of this core platform that we're building, and that's coming back to some of the other questions in terms of the visions for 5 years. Vision for 5 years. This isn't a UK problem. This is a problem which is all over globally, and I suppose open banking has enabled it quite drastically in a great way. But open banking is rolling out across the world. So Australia have reached out to us, and they're trying to do something similar in terms of shared infrastructure branches, because branches are diminishing in numbers as well. Someone in Asia has reached out, and we're actually planning to roll this out into Europe at the end of year 2. Because again, open banking is very prevalent in Europe, and the problem exists in Europe as well. Everybody is going cashless at different rates. Obviously, Scandinavia is far ahead of the UK. This sort of shared infrastructure solution is similar to the Link network in 2002, where banks used to own their own ATMs, and then there was a shared infrastructure ATM solution, and that's normal now. And what OneBanks is trying to do is not just implement parts of the solution, but actually have the whole, all the different elements of a bank branch in that one physical location, to support everybody in society, and try to just ensure that everybody has got different needs and try to support as much of that as possible.
You super ambitious plans, and you've done a lot already, and you are in early stages before you've even launched. And there are questions about the burn rate, and clearly there's a fundraise at some point as well.
So in terms of the burn rate, the team members, that we're employing to run the kiosk are the main cost in the business. The actual expenditure to get a kiosk up and running is relatively low. Something else, just going back to a previous point, is the potential of OneBanks being the future of an ATM. One of the banks said that they like the OneBank solution because they see us as an alternative to the Link network in the long term. And I completely get that. As I said, going back to what I said earlier, we're going to go cardless before we go cashless. So the fact that we are introducing a way in which people can withdraw money just using their face without a card and using faster payments and open banking to enable that is really attractive for the banks, because that's another way in which we can grow this going forward. But yeah, burn rate, we ensure that I think it's around 4 banks that we need to have signed up to break even.
There are lots of questions about people asking whether you've got an agreement with all the UK banks or not.
It's all in due course.
Getting there slowly.
Yes.
What's the launch date? The official launch date?
The 4th of December.
Right.
So 4th of the 7th. We're all steam ahead trying to get everything ready for then. So yeah.
So okay, that we'll all be watching on the 4th of December as well, or the 7th of December. There's a question about money transfer as well.
I'm just having like, so how can OneBank help a money transfer company who want their customers to have a variety of payment methods? So a money transfer company. So in terms of open banking, the PISP element, you can set up direct debits, you can set up lots of different ways of paying money. If that answers the question at all.
Find out from that person. Okay, so another question has come up from Stacey. Would you be able to offer money transfer services overseas?
Yeah, so that's something, as I mentioned earlier, is definitely in the pipeline for next year.
I would imagine you might partner with somebody for that as well, since
I suspect so. Whether it's
a number,
Western Union would make sense.
Yeah, there's so many options, aren't there? Yeah, World Remit. Someone's asked a question. Chris has asked a question about the tech base. How resilient is the tech base, and what about internet speed in remote areas to matter to the delivery?
Good question. So in terms of our internet speed, we've got routers, we've got network. We're working with BT, and I mean for Denny, where we're going live, there is 3G, 4G, so there's no issues with that there. But going forward, it's definitely something we need to look into to make sure that the internet speed is of sufficient quality. But yeah, that's a good point.
Are all the kiosks inside somewhere, or are some of them actually going to be physically outside, but in a kind of enclosed hub? So if I went to the middle of a shopping mall, for example, is that a possibility?
So yeah, at the moment we're planning just to go inside different, whether it's supermarkets, for example, and our strategy is very much so we pick a community, we work with the banks, we use data to select a community which is underbanked. And actually just going back to sort of that patient strategy, i.e. we got data from the local data company of the number of bank branches that have closed, live banks, live post offices, deprivation of people, population, and number of small independents. And using all of that data, we found Denny, we selected Denny, and it was all based on data. And one of my favorite experiences of this journey so far is actually going to Denny and speaking to the Denny community support group and just listening to the fact that financial inclusion and access to cash are 2 of the main things on their agenda at the moment. And a lot of people in their community struggle, and they were just so excited about OneBanks and what we're doing that they applied for the community's access to cash pilot there and then, and they've since been accepted. So we will always choose a community and then identify a suitable location partner in that community, which is at the focal point of that community. So a supermarket is a good example, because there's quite often a supermarket in the focal point of a town. But
so someone's asking the question, does that mean that you're unlikely to open outlets in London? Although we do have some disadvantaged communities and some in London.
In the short term, we'll look to focus on areas which are underbanked. London, obviously, the majority of people in London. I say that actually is testing my memory here, whether I can get the statistic off the top of my head. But anyway, a lot of people in London are far more digital, and I suppose to begin with, we are trying to help those who are underbanked and maybe prefer that human interaction. Whereas, so I think not initially will be in London, but it'll definitely be in the rollout plan. Banks will continue to diminish in numbers, so yes, I'm sure there will be a OneBanks kiosk in London at some point. So how would we
There's
work
a,
that?
there's a question about issues as well, which from Trisha. What happens if there's a problem, right? If there's a problem with a deposit, if there's a problem with the bank, if I'm disputing something, for example, can I work that out at the kiosk?
So you can get help. We'll provide that support. We're not able to offer advice to begin with, but
Right.
in terms
Okay.
of problems that arise, we've come up with ways, step-by-step processes where we'll identify anything that goes wrong and we'll know where it's gone wrong and why it's gone wrong, and we've come up with ways to rectify those. Going back to Abby's question here, how will OneBank stop vulnerable customers being exploited who may be forced to use their face to access money? So we've got 2 team members in the kiosk, and I think as part of the training that we're doing, we're using Accenture to deliver the training to the team members. They are going to be trained to spot duress. Where risk is far less than the risks associated with cards. A lot of ATMs now, you can actually withdraw money using contactless, and having facial biometrics as the core to the security of OneBanks is, I think, far less risky and supports vulnerable customers not being exploited going forward.
And I think there's been, it maybe hasn't happened as quickly as we might have expected it to, but facial biometrics has had a, it's been happening over time, possibly again accelerated by COVID, where people are viewing it more positively. So in various, whether there's the facial biometrics, there's also things like your fingerprints and blood flow and vein flow and other things that you can use to identify yourself or identify a different bank or a different card that's attached to some part of your body. But I think facial biometrics, also people at airports have become more used to it. When we could travel, you could scan your iris if you've got one of those digitally enabled passports, you can go through that, or the iris registration. So I guess that people are becoming more familiar with that. I think the question about advisors who obtain client bank statements via open banking, I think, again, it goes back to the same thing. It's the bank, isn't it? If I'm saying the bank, it's okay for me to share this data with the advisor.
So we're not an advisor as such. So we're given access to the data, yes, but ultimately the relationship is always with the bank, and we'll make that very clear. All we're doing is enabling access, and ideally we'll have some sort of direct way into the bank. So if we've got queries that we can't deal with ourselves, we'll know who to go to, we'll know how to help them, albeit it is a case of helping them get in touch with the underlying bank. Having that physical point. I know one of the banks in Denny, they use a Costa coffee shop to go and speak to people and offer sort of advice and support. And one of the things they've suggested is using the OneBanks kiosk.
Yeah, the coffee shop seems a bit open for me.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is
so there's loan worker questions for safeguarding, and will you be able to print bank statements from the kiosk, for example, to use on a mortgage application?
So for printing bank statements, not immediately, but that is something we are looking into. And again, open banking helps significantly with mortgage applications, whereby you can share your bank statements with a third party, for example, a mortgage broker, and you don't have to print it out and then send it for a mortgage application. And it's about having that sort of education of the benefits of open banking to help with that. But no, that's a good point, and that is definitely something that's on our agenda. Again, it's just there's lots of product developments on the roadmap.
And I think as we talk and as we listen, I think you can see that initially I can see you're starting out, you have the agreements with the banks. The bank is key here, in which case, if I have the open banking ability to share my data, I can share my data with the bank. Eventually, if we get to people that are unbanked, that's a different story. And I can see some of the questions relate to people who are unbanked as well. Yes, there is, Ian is correct. There's just so much to do.
There's a lot
I would
to do.
agree with you. Yeah.
And as I said, I will, do you mind if I share my screen very quickly?
Oh, no, go ahead. You go ahead. Let me just check our time. We have 8 minutes left. So you're good.
Just out of...
the kiosk.
I thought it'd be interesting just to see, here's what the kiosk looks like to begin with. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is experience 1, where someone can come, sit down, speak to a member of the team. This is experience 2, which is over the counter. And then finally, this is experience 3, which is a self-service ATM.
Very cool.
Stop sharing there, but that's
now we
what
know what it looks like,
that's
right?
what it looks like, and it's built very modularly. It's a very modular design, and it's currently around 6 meters by 3 meters, and we're trying to make it as modular as possible so we can fit it into different stores, etc. going forward, and we can roll this out as quickly as possible. But Ian, you are correct. There is a lot to do, and it's been a very, very busy year.
Duncan, why did you? I know you said you went to California, you came back, you saw the problem. This is not an easy journey. What made you decide to step out of the KPMG world, to step, you've got a background in accountancy and consultancy. You could have stayed there.
I really enjoy working with people. And again, it's just going back to the fact that people need people. I think I always, and that's how OneBanks has got to where we are today, is the fact that people have been so helpful. I've been very lucky with the team that I've built and the partners that we're working with to get us to the stage that we're at, ready to launch. And I think I just love working with people, and actually the fact that OneBanks is doing something good in society, that drives me hugely to get this up and running. And again, it's just all the small things. A startup journey is never easy. Everyone always says it's ups and downs, but to be perfectly honest, you only really notice the downs, and then in hindsight you're like, well, maybe that wasn't that bad. But there's wee things that have happened that have been like, well, what I'm doing is definitely worth it. An example is one of the council members in Scotland reached out to me following the TSB bank closures and said that she'd heard about OneBanks, what we're doing, and two of the areas that she works in will be hugely disadvantaged. There's a lot of vulnerable customers that are going to be left behind, and she was furious about the bank closures, and to the extent that she actually wrote to TSB asking about working with OneBanks going forward, and she just wanted to find out more about OneBanks, what we're doing, and how it can get plugged into her communities. So it just showed the fact that there is demand for this. This will help a lot of people, and yeah, everybody's talking about open banking, open data, open finance, but it's all about ensuring that everybody's on that journey and it benefits everybody.
We're either talking about open banking or embedded finance, aren't we? Okay. Let's just see what else people are asking us before we can close. Oops, let's just go down a little bit. He says.
So someone said lots of fine tuning required.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, to have the full solution. However, what we are providing is similar to the post office. What we're providing will help a lot of people in itself. There's a lot of additions. I wouldn't say fine tuning. I'd say things that will just continue to improve the service. But the service as it is, small businesses, individuals have got a place they can go to. They can learn about online banking, open banking, get signed up to OneBanks, and they can do cash deposits, cash withdrawals for any bank and make payments. So that in itself will help a lot of people.
I think
and someone's actually just sorry, Helene. Just
go ahead. No, it's just this question about how you're going to convince banks to pay you. I personally can see that you'd be a help to a banks. It would take one thing off their plate, but Stephen.
So in terms of the app, yes, we've got an app, and you can download the app and you can make payments to and from any bank account, and you can have, instead of having 10, you're never going to have 10 bank accounts, but myself, I've got 3 different bank accounts. I can just use OneBanks app, have it all in one place and make payments and view all of the transactions in one place. So yes, that is something that we have, and you can make payments from any of these accounts and between the accounts. In terms of making money, and that was, again, going back to the sort of value proposition for the banks, it is, as we said earlier, banks are closing, and we are shifting towards a digital future. And as we said, the word vulnerable customers, as I said, I don't like, because it's split up into so many different groups, and all those different groups of people need different things. They all have different requirements, and it's not commercially viable for the banks to maintain a physical presence to facilitate all of those individual people's needs. And that's where a OneBanks kiosk can help the banks help their customers. And They are closing bank branches. They cost them £700,000 a year. So they're saving a huge number of costs. However, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place at the moment. The government are going to put more and more pressure on them to maintain a physical presence in the high street. And OneBanks provides them with that physical presence.
It's very true. Nicola Sturgeon's been very vocal about this in Scotland, but also I think, as I said, the FCA will come down. Will come down with some regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. Like in Ireland and America, they've got regulations at the moment. So yeah, it's just a matter of time before the UK government step up and
absolutely. The FCA has had this big discussion. It's very different to 2007, 2008 right now. But I think we have time. The last question is, what level of iOS or Android development is required for the app to work?
Oh, what do you know? What level of iOS development is in what?
Lindsay, do you want to? She can maybe elaborate on that. And Marta is telling us that it's a brilliant concept, and I appreciate that. I agree. But that was I think that was, where are we in terms of time? We were 1 minute. So if someone wants to expand on the question about the
our
iOS
is available for iOS
13 or later.
Exactly what it is. Yeah, I don't have that answer off the top of my head. I need to ask him to have.
Ask the techies. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Well, back to the
future. I love that. Indeed. Absolutely. You have to go back to go forward and make sure that it's available to everybody. Paul, I'm going to use that going forward.
And other inter-country transactions, I think, cross-border transactions?
Well, cross-border transactions at the moment, so cross-border transactions, all for that. Money remittance abroad is definitely something that we'll look to do, because there's a lot of people in the UK that do that. It's still use cash. They get paid in cash and just send cash to potentially their family in a different country. So that's something we're definitely trying to facilitate as soon as possible.
I am sure that we could talk about this for hours and hours.
It was really interesting. It's so many different things. It's digital adoption, it's financial inclusion, it's
exactly. And I appreciate that you are at the early stage of your journey, but there's points about access and availability and what the regulators are looking at, and how banks have made an attempt at this before, and they're making their balance sheets look better by closing their retail outlets under the now guise of COVID, but also the fact that people are not attending as much. They still need to provide a solution, because it will be mandated at some point in the very near future that you have to provide. And also they should be wanting to provide a solution for everybody who's been a customer for 35 years or 3 years or 5 years. Thank you, Zahir, you're welcome. And you are providing that solution. You've come up with lots of different ways for you to go forward, and my head's buzzing a little bit about all the things that you can add, I'm sure, as you go along. And I would like to think that we'll all stay connected to you. What's a good way to stay in touch? Is it LinkedIn? Is it the website? So that
LinkedIn. We've got a contact form on the website, and even on the website, you can actually there's a Tableau map where you can request a OneBanks kiosk.
Oh,
but okay. LinkedIn and Twitter are the best ways of keeping in touch. LinkedIn for announcements.
That would be fantastic. I think it would be great if we can all stay connected, and then maybe come back in after December, maybe in the spring of next year, and we can see where you've gone and how it's changed. I think it's fascinating, and I think we'll watch your development and your fundraise, and we'll watch the regulatory side of it, and we'll see what happens with all of not just the tier 1 incumbents, but the tier 1s, the tier 2s, and as we go further down the chain to the neos as well, who could engage with you. Thank you to everyone, and thank you to Duncan, and thank you to the events team as well. So I don't know that we need to do our poll again. Are we all agreeing in the same way as we did at the beginning, that we still need a physical outlet? I think we probably would be.
It's changing.
Yeah.
The need to be one thing, but it's certainly changing.
Yes. Thank you, Bill, Marion. Thank you, everybody. I think we've now gone 2 minutes over our time. So we'll let the events team take over. And Duncan, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who came to join us as well. And we'll see you at the next webinar.